We're going to start from the Mishnah on Kuf Beis Amud Beis, because we really didn't get a chance to do it thoroughly yesterday. Zok the Heilige Mishnah on Kuf Beis Amud Beis. Oh, good morning, Duvi. Ha'omer harei alai b'machvas. Someone said, I'm accepting upon myself to bring a mincha b'machvas, but v'hevi b'marcheshes. He brought a mincha in a marcheshes. B'marcheshes. And marcheshes is a deep pan, and machvas is a flat pan. B'marcheshes v'hevi b'machvas. So the halacha is mashahevi hevi. He brought a fair mincha, it's a good mincha, but v'yidei chayvasa lo yotza. Surely it's a kosher mincha, but he didn't fulfill what he said he would do. Now, what about zu lohavi b'machvas? He pointed to this flour, and he said, this flour I'm designating to be a minchas machvas, v'hevi b'marcheshes, or vice versa. He said, zu b'marcheshes, v'hevi b'machvas. So then harezu psula, because it's designated as a minchas machvas, yet you processed it as a minchas marcheshes, and vice versa. Now the Mishnah offers a very similar case with a small variation. The Gemara is going to ask, why was it necessary for the Mishnah to say another variation of the same halacha? Someone said, I'm going to bring a mincha, not of one isarin, which is the standard, rather with two israinis, lahavi b'chliachad, but I'm going to bring it as one big mincha. V'hevi b'shnei kelim, or vice versa. He said, I'll bring two menachos, b'shnei kelim, v'hevi b'chliachad, mashahevi hevi, v'yidei chayvasa layatza. However, if he said, elu b'chliachad, he had a keli with two israinis, and he said, this is going to be one big mincha. V'hevi b'shnei kelim, or he said, this flour I'm going to bring in two kelim, two menachos, v'hevi b'chliachad, then harei elu psul. Now we have another interesting case. Harei alai shnei esrainos lahavi b'chliachad. So it's the same case as before. He said, I'm going to bring a big mincha of two esrainos. V'hevi b'shnei kelim. So before we said that the mincha that he brought is kosher, but he wasn't yotzes chayv. But here's something else happened. He's bringing it. Everybody knows that he promised to bring two esrainos in one keli as one big mincha. He's bringing it as two menachos. So Amr Loi, the people told him, that's not what you obliged yourself to do. B'chli echad nadarta. Now, if in fact he was just bringing a separate carbon, not to fulfill his nether, and he was still going to fulfill his nether at a later time, that's what he should have said. But he didn't. He just went on, and he krivan b'shnei kelim. So there it's psulun, because it's clear that his intent is to be yoytze his original nether. And therefore it's going to be possible because he wants this to be the sarin, and he brought it in two kelim. Or b'chliacha, but b'chliacha is ksherin. What same thing with the other way around. Harei alai shnei esrainos lavi b'shnei kelim vevi b'chliachad. And then, again, they pointed it out to him. Amar loy b'shnei kelim nadarta. So if hikrivan b'shnei kelim, it'll be ksherim. But nosnu l'kliachad. But if it was in one keli, kishtei menachos shenesarva. We look at it like it's two separate menachos that are now in one big keli. And as long as you could take a kamitza from each one individually, and one won't contaminate the other, it would be kosher. Zok Gemara u'tzricha. We needed the Mishnah to tell us this case, sai by machvas and marcheshes, and sai by two esrainim and one esrainim. The yashminon hach kamaisa, if we only had the case of machvas and marcheshes, mishum davar b'machvas v'kamaisi b'marcheshes. It's a completely different mincha. And it's just a question of how much is in the nether. Let's say he was judge's nether. He's bringing the same type of mincha, he's just bringing a little more, a little less. But if we only had the case of two esrainim and one esrainim, I would have said because you're splitting up the mincha. But if you're just using a different type of keli, but it's still the same mincha, the same content, it shouldn't make a difference. That's why the Mishnah repeated the same halacha twice. One when there's a variation in the type of mincha, and one was when there was a variation in the size of the mincha. Tanu Rabbanan Mashahevi Hevi, then Yidei Nidra Layatza, which is our Mishnah, but Reb Shimon argues on our Mishnah. And Reb Shimon says, Af Yidei Nidrei Nami Yotza. So you might ask, why would you be Yotze? He said he's going to bring a machvas, and he brought a marcheshus. Zokt Rashi, because Reb Shimon Shita is Akula Masnisin Polig, the Kasavar Kivuusa, the Mana Lav Kolumhu. Not Lav Klu, Lav Klumu. The fact that I said I'm going to bring in a machvas, I'm going to bring in a marcheshus, that's not machayiv me. It's just mechayiv me to bring a mincha. The only thing that designates what it has to be is once I put it in that keli to bring, that's when it becomes designated. Okay, so Gemara weiter. Zu lahavi b'machvas. He said this specific wheat is going to be brought in a minchas machvas. So the halacha is then it will be possible if he brought it in a marcheshus. Didn't we learn that the klisharis is not mekadeshit, and therefore lekichum oisan klisharis shavim by the chivin the lekichum, since the klisharis doesn't have an impact on the mincha, amai psulos. If he's bringing it in a marcheshus and he said this is a machvas, why is it possible? Big deal that he put it into marcheshus. Hamoti lahadurinu ilasuye boisin comes another. So he's bringing it now in a marcheshus. Big deal. He'll just transfer it over. The fact that it was in a keli doesn't mean anything. Zok Gemara, Amar Abaya loy kitchum likarev. That we say that it doesn't become kadosh likarev only when it goes into the keli in the Beis Hamikdash after the Kmitza, that Lagabe being machshir the koimitz to be placed on the Mizbeach. Avol kitchum liposel, but it is mekadeshit to pasel. So Vibalti said he was going to use this flour to bring on minchas machvas, and he placed it into a marcheshus, even though it's not mekadeshit in ganzen, but it's enough that it would pasel it. V'yamar Abaye said another halacha. Lo yishanu. We don't say that it's going to be possible. Ella shekavan b'shas neder. You know when he said, I'm going to bring this as a machvas, b'shas neder. Originally, he made a neder, he took flour, and he said, this flour I'm going to give as a minchas machvas. Then it's designated as a minchas machvas. But what if he just said, this flour is going to be a mincha? And he didn't designate what it's going to be. And then, when he was mafresh the flour, he said, I want this to be a machvas. You know why? Because the shas afrosha has no binding feature. Because it says, Vosisa kasher nadarta, what you were makabel upon yourself, that's what you have to bring. V'loi kasher frashta. So if someone said, Arei alai mincha, and then he was mafresh it, and he said, okay, this is going to be my machvas, that doesn't matter, he can make it a marcheshus, because there's no validity to his designation with shas afrosha. The validity of his designation is only when he makes the original neder. Itmar nami omer Rab Acha bar Chanina omer Rab Asi omer Rabbi Yochanan leishono shekavan b'shas neder avol b'shas afrosha loy kasher nedarta v'loy kasher hifrashta. Zok the Mishnah. Ha'omer harei alai mincha minas ha'orim. What if someone says harei alai mincha minas ha'orim? Now we know you don't bring a mincha minas ha'orim. Minchas choytei. A minchas soit is menasorim, but a normal mincha is of course menachitin. The loch is javi menachitin. He has to bring from chitin. He said only menasorim. We're going to soon see why. What about if he said harei la mincha kemach, and kemach is not the high enough grade of flour with which to bring a mincha? The loch is javi soilas. What if he said harei la mincha beloy shemen ubeloy levayna? Too bad. He's mechuyev to bring a mincha with all of its halachas, yavi shemen ulavayna. What if he said harei alai mincha chati yisarin? Now we know mincha is an yisarin. Too bad. He's mechuyev to bring a mincha yavi yisarin shalim. What if he said harei alai mincha of yisarin umechza yavi shnayim? You have to bring two israinis. So you have to find out v'sapes. He has to bring two. Maybe it's a mincha of 1.5. So we're going to have to see. Rabbi Shimon Poiter. Rabbi Shimon says that in all these cases you're potter. You know why? Shaloyis nadiv keder chamis natin. This is not called a proper kabbalas mincha because you didn't make the neder in the normal way that people make it. Zogt a heilige Gemara. Amai, why is it that if you said Arei Alai Mincha bin Asairin, why am I mechuyev to bring a mincha from Chitin? Neder upischa imayu. I was literally chayzer toich chedei dibur. As Rashi says, Amai mechuyev la'asuye min achitin, neder upischa imayu, im ha-neder amar pesach shem mischaret boy. As he's saying the neder, he's also creating the pesach that he's shoyal on his neder with because he has charata. The Kivud Amar Min Asoyer, when it was Toich Kedei Dibur, Amrinon, the Ein B'dai Teloi V'klum. He surely does not want to bring a mincha. The Adam Yodeya Shed Mincha Min Asoyer. So when he said Arei Mincha and Toich Kedei Dibur, he said Min Asoyer, that should be a Chazara Toich Kedei Dibur. So why is he Mechuyev a mincha? Omar Chizkiya Hamani Beishamai. The Tana of our Mishnah is Beishamai. Beishamai has a sheet of the Amrit Tvois Lashon Rishon. Whenever you have a contradiction between the first thing that someone said and then the second thing that someone said, Harei Eloi Mincha, which means Chitin, Minasoyer, it's a stira, you always go boss of the Lashon Rishon and you ignore what he said later. As Rashi says, Tvois Lashon Rishon, B'chiv and Amar Harei Eloi Mincha. At that moment, we Toifus is Lashon Rishon, Yichai B'Mincha Hayenes. And therefore, we ignore the second comment that he makes. And we see this elsewhere. It's not we learned. Hareni Nazir. Now, what is a Nazir prohibited from? He's prohibited from drinking wine. But he said, Hareni Nazir mina groigros. Groigros are figs. That's not a valid Naziris. So if someone said, Hareni Nazir mina groigros, uminat vela, Beishamai Arimim Nazir. Why? Because the moment he said, Hareni Nazir, he's a Nazir mina yain. Twice Lashon Rishon, and you ignore his additional comments of Minagroigus or Minat Vela. But if Basil any Nazir, he's not a Nazir. So we're going to have to understand what Basil Shita is, and it seems like our Mishnah will not be consistent with Basil because Basil holds you look at the whole thing that he said. So Bechizkiah is learning our Mishnah is going according to Beishamai. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, we can even say that our Mishnah is consistent with Beis Hillel. You could even say it's going like Beis Hillel. But Omer, it's speaking where the person who made the neder, so what did he say? He said, and then they told him, look, what are you talking about? Well, Sarim is not a mincha. So he said, oh, you're right. And then he said, if I would have known that you can't make a mincha min asayirin, I would have never said Soirin. I would have said Chitin. So he clearly expressed now that he wants to be Mechayiv himself in a mincha. So normally, Beis Hillel would say, Ein a Nazir. If someone said, already Nazir min HaGregush min Vela, that's not a proper Kabbalas Naziris, because you don't go about Tafas Losharishin. But in our case, it's speaking where he said Beferish, he clarified his words. And he said, Avada, I meant to be Mekabal Mincha. I made a mistake. I thought you could bring a mincha from Soirin. But had I known the halacha was chitin, of course I would have said chitin. So therefore, it's a nukimta. We're saying the Mishnah is speaking not on the standard case, where he said, Harei ala mincha min Soirin. You have to add into it. And then they asked him, what are you talking about? And then he responded, no, I really want to bring a proper mincha. That's what the case of our Mishnah is, and therefore it will even be consistent with Beis Hillel. Zok to Gemara Vayter. Amar Chizkiah. Now, Chizkiah told us a moment ago that the author of our Mishnah is Beishamai, who holds Tzvos Lashon Rishon. So now Chizkiah makes an additional comment. Lo Shanu, that we say he's a Nazir, is Elo de Omar Mincha Min Asayirin. That we said Mincha Min Asayirin. Aval Omar Mincha Min Ha'adashim, which is like totally off base. So Arim is in the parsha. You have a Minchas Choyte. There is something called the Minchas Arim. You have the Mincha on Shavuos. The Shtei Alechem is Arim. I'm sorry, the Minchas Omer on Pesach is Arim. But if you said Adashim, which is like totally out to lunch, Loi. Frank the Gemara doesn't make any sense because the whole svara of Chizkiah is because of Beis Shammai Tfos Lashon Rishon. So what's the difference what he added afterwards? The moment he said Arei Ala Mincha, nothing else that he says should impact it. So Frank Gemara Michti, Chizkiah command Omer L'Shmaitze. How did Chizkiah understand our Mishnah? He understood our Mishnah like Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai. Ubeis Shammai mishum Tfos Lashon Rishonu. So Oibazoi Mali Min Asayin, Mali Min Ha'adoshim. What does it make a difference what he says afterwards? All we focus on is the Harei Olai Mincha. Zok the Gemara, from the fact that Chizkiah made the distinction between Adoshim and Tzorim, it proves that he must have changed his mind. And he regrets, he no longer learns our Mishnah is going like Beis Shammai. Chizkiah must agree with Rabbi Yochanan that our Mishnah is going like Beis Hillel. Hoderbe, he was chayzer from stelling on the Mishnah like Beis Shammai. Umay time Hoderbe, why was he chayzer? Because he saw it from the Mishnah. Omarav Masnisan Kashise, because the Mishnah picks on the Afka case of Harei Olai Mincha Min HaSorin. Why didn't our Mishnah say a bigger chiddush? Harei Olai Mincha even Min HaDoshim. My ear, the Tani Mincha Min HaSorin, listening Min HaDoshim. El Shema Mina, it makes a difference. And Min HaDoshim would not be a Mincha. Why? Shema Mina Mishum de Toihu. Obviously, he made a mistake in how he expressed his chiyah for the mincha, and we look at everything that he says. B'sa'orim toi. By Sorim, we could have said he made a mistake, and therefore we could say that if you ask him later and he says, "Oh, of course I meant to be mekabel upon myself on mincha. I made a mistake. I thought Sorim are good." But with Adoshim Loitoi, he can't say, "Oh, I made a mistake. I thought you could bring a mincha from Adoshim." Nobody thinks that you could bring a mincha from Adoshim. So if he said Adoshim, he's clearly saying, "I don't want to bring the mincha." So therefore, according to Beis Hillel, you don't say Tfais Lashon Rishon, he wouldn't be mechuyev for the mincha. He could only say that I made a mistake, but I really meant to be mekabel a mincha from chitin if he said Sa'arin, because Sa'arin is plausible that he would have made that mistake. Rabbi Yochanan said, Afilu min ha'adoshim. Rabbi Yochanan said, even if he said min ha'adoshim, it's also going to be a mincha, which is shver because we just said he holds like Beis Hillel, and no one makes such a mistake. Rabbi Yochanan command Omer l'shmaitze. How did Rabbi Yochanan understand our Mishnah? Ke Beis Hillel. Ubeis Hillel mishum detayu. And the whole reason why Beis Hillel holds in our Mishnah that he was mechayev himself to bring a mincha, even though you look at the second thing he said, is because when he said sa'irin, we could say it's an honest mistake, but he really would wanted to be mekabel upon himself a mincha, which you cannot say by sa'irin. So I bezoi uveis Hillel mishum detayu hu b'sa'irin the toyu b'sa'irin toyu ba'adoshim loy toyu. So I bezoi, how could Rabbi Yochanan say that if there was a case of adoshim, it would also be chiyah for a mincha? Zok Gemara, you're right. He doesn't hold like that. Avada, he holds b'sa'irim toy, ba'adoshim loy toy. And if someone said a rei olai mincha adoshim, avada, it's not a good kabbalah mincha. But what Rabbi Yochanan is doing is he's playing devil's advocate with Chizkiah. The dvar of the Chizkiah ka'amarle. And he said, we just said a moment ago, that Chizkiah must have been chayzer. He originally learned the Mishnah like Beis Shammai, but then he changed his mind. Why did he change his mind? Because according to Beis Shammai, there shouldn't be a difference between Min HaSorin or Min HaAdoshim, because it's Tfais Lashon Rishon. And the Mishnah says Min HaSorin. So it must be that the Mishnah holds that Min HaAdoshim, even Beis Shammai would be moided that it's not going to be a Kabbalah Mincha. So on that, Chizkiah said that's not true. At my time, a Hodritbach. What was the reason why we just articulated why it is that Chizkiah changed his mind to learn that our Mishnah is not like Beis Shammai? Mishum de lekatani min ha'adoshim. Because if you're like Beis Shammai, the Mishnah should have said a bigger chiddush that even if you said min ha'adoshim, it doesn't matter because you don't look at what he said later. You only look at the Lashon Rishon. But that's not a good kasha. Zokt Chizkiah. You know what? Dr. B'yoichin. It's not a good kasha because Dilma loimi boika amar. Maybe the Mishnah is expressing a loimi boy. Loimi boy min ha'adoshim. It's pashut min ha'adoshim. The ikala meimer mahader hu dehader. There you can say that he's knowingly trying to reverse his commitment. And vibalt utfois lashon rishon, you don't let him back out. So that's pashut. The Mishnah didn't need to tell me that if he said arei alai mincha min ha'adoshim, that he's mechuyev mincha, because it's very clear that he's trying to back out from his commitment, because everybody knows you cannot bring a mincha from adoshim. El afilu min hasayirin nami. But the Mishnah is saying a chiddush, even if someone said arei alai mincha min hasayirin, the ikal meimar mita hu dekatoi, you could possibly say that mita hudikatoi, and he's being chayzer because he thought that he would only have to bring soyim, and he has a good reason to be shoyl on his nether. Nevertheless, he can't shoyl on his nether. Afilu hachi tfois loshen rishon. Let's have a look at Rashi. At my time, hadrochba. So Rabbi Yochanan asked Chizkiah, why did you change your mind and no longer learn our Mishnah like by Shammai? Lididach, ikal trutzei, the loim yiboy kamar. You could have said that the Mishnah is saying a loim yiboy, and that would have fit in very good why the Mishnah chapped on sa'orim and not adoshim. Loim yiboy adoshim. The kiv and the kaim alon tfois loshen rishoin, the chayiv, the kiv and the loy tobu inchi. Since nobody thinks you could bring a mincha from adoshim, so how would you verteich what he's saying? When he said Harayla Mincha, it's a full Kabbalah's Mincha. Now he wanted to change his mind, so what did he do? He figures I'll say Min Adoshim so that it'll undermine the first thing that I said. And that doesn't work. Why? That's the shita of Beis Shammai. You can't be choshev even take the libur. You're twice lashon rishon. Avol sa'irin, but if what he said was menasa'irin, the ikala meimar, you could say even the tobu inchi. Since it's reasonable to say that people might think that it's legit to bring a mincha from sa'irin, ema meikara lav mincha ichaven. Maybe he never had in mind to be mechayiv himself a minchas chitin. Ela la mincha sa'irin. Mamish, maybe he just wanted to be mechayiv himself to bring a mincha soirim to parish. Since there is no such thing, lifater. So if he said bin adoshim, we know for sure he's trying to reverse what he said. But min hasarim, it could be that was his original intention. He only wanted to donate. Soirim not chitin. The vadim otzi omar ilu ayisi oideya the soifi lavi chitin. It's a very legitimate time now. I only wanted to give sorim, which are not as expensive. Had I known that it's being mechayiv me by saying arayla mincha, I'm being mechayiv myself to bring chitin, I would have never made such a neder. Kavash malona by Shammai that even that you can't do. It's tvois loshem rishon. So zokt Rabbi Yochanan to Chizkiah, you had no reason to reverse your understanding of the Mishnah because you legitimately could have remained with understanding our Mishnah according to Beis Shammai. Gewaltig. Let's do that with Beis. Omar Zeiri. Zeiri said, Loi shanu ella de Omar mincha. This halacha that you're mechuyev a mincha, even though you said it in Asarin, is only if you said Harei olai mincha min hasa'orin. But if you said mincha misa'orin, then it wouldn't be the same. Mincha loy. So if I say mincha min hasa'orin, so I said mincha, that's machayiv me right away chitin. Min hasa'orin is an extra word. Question is, do you look at it? But if you said mincha sa'orin, it's one statement. So the mincha alone would not have been mechayiv for chitin, because the word mincha sa'orin is one word. That's one pshat in Rashi, which we're going to stick with. Let's see Rashi. Rashi actually has a second pshat as well. Lo yishon the top of lashon rishon elo the amar mincha min hasa'orim. The ikal meimar kivin amar mincha. Once you did a reyalai mincha le mincha gemur kamachaven. By adding min hasa'orim, it won't undo it. Avol amar mincha sa'orim. So that's one big word. Mincha hasa'orim kai. The word mincha is connected to the word sa'orim. Therefore, upater. The lekala meimer tvois lashon rishon. You cannot say tvois lashon rishon if it's one big expression. That's one shot, and that's what we're going to stick with. It fits in better with the Gemara later on. Lish nachrina avaloyim mincha. If he didn't say the word mincha at all, he just said harei alai min hasoyin. Lish nachrina avaloyim mincha ela harei alai soyin pater devade lesoyin echad. You don't say if a guy said because we know if you say harei lachitin, that automatically means he wants to make a mincha. It's another way of expressing a mincha. So Aryam doesn't cut it. So Amar Ziri Lo Yishanu El Amar Mincha. So we're going to learn Mincha Min HaSayin and not Mincha Sayin. Avaloy Amar Mincha Loy. Yosy Rab Nachman the Kamil Allah Shmaitze. Rab Nachman was saying over Ziri's halacha. Esei Rabba Rab Nachman. So Rabba challenged Rab Nachman and he said as follows. Our Mishnah says If someone said Arei alai mincha min a kemach, the halach is Yavi Soilas. But it just says kemach in our Mishnah. It doesn't say Arei alai mincha min kemach. So isn't Pashup Pshat on the Mishnah lav the loy amar mincha? He just said Arei alai kemach, and you see that the word kemach will mean a mincha. Zokt Maloi, that's not Pshat in the Mishnah. The amar mincha, he said mincha. Even though the Tana doesn't quote those words, it's understood that it's just instead of saying mincha min asayin, he said mincha min akemach. What about the third case in the Mishnah? If someone said arei mincha beloy shemen ulevayna, yavi shemen ulevayna. Again, my love, the aloy amar mincha, because it just says in the Mishnah ha'amar beloy shemen ulevayna. The Mishnah doesn't speak out the word mincha again. Again, the amar mincha. Now it's this case where Rashi's second chart wouldn't make sense. Minchas sa'orin, minchas kemach, you could say, but minchas beloy shemen ulevayna, that whole expression doesn't make sense. That's why we like Rashi's first pshat better. What about chatzi isarin? The halach is yava isarin shalim. My love, the lo amar mincha. That's lo the amar mincha. So we're basically asking the same kasha over and over and over again, because in each case of the Mishnah, it doesn't speak on mincha. So we assume he just said those words. Zok Gemara, no, he said mincha min in each case. Frank the Gemara, if that's the case, we have a problem. Ihachi ema seifa. Let's look at the seifa of our Mishnah. What if he said arei mincha isarain umechza? The halach is yaveh shnayim. Why should you be yaveh shnayim if you said arei mincha isarain umechza? Kivin damar mincha. The moment he said arei mincha, ichayiv lei be isarin. He's mechuyev in a minchas isarin, right? That's what mincha means. So when he says chatzi isarin, that's like a whole separate mimer. And Chatzi Yisarin doesn't mean anything at all, because the Chatzi Yisarin doesn't have Mincha Chatzi Yisarin. It's Minchas Yisarin, V'Chatzi Yisarin. So Minchas Yisarin means a Mincha V'Yisarin. The V'Chatzi Yisarin doesn't have a Mincha preceding it, so it's nothing. Kiyomer Chatzi Yisarin loy klum ka'amar. Zok Rashi, Iyachi Ema Seifa, I mean Zok Toysus, Iyachi Ema Seifa, Yisarin Mechza, Bishlama Iloy Amar Mincha. Bishlama, if the case is, even if he didn't say mincha, ma'isi trei, v'oimer idli ha'yisaydeya, if I would have known that you have to bring two, I would have sure brought two. Alakivin to amar minchas isarin umechza, amai may be trei. Why does he have to bring two anachis? Ha'amrit, we just said, teichad loyar mincha ein klum. On the umechza, there's no mincha. V'mkein mishum oisech chatzi isarin loy laisi klum. That shouldn't be mechav you for with anything, because it doesn't have mincha. Okay, Zok to Gemara. Kiyomer Chatzi Zorin loy klum ka'amar. I think the base takes out the word hey. Yeah. Zok to Gemara loy tricha. The case is the Omar harei alai mincha chatzi isarin v'isarin. He didn't say isarin first. He said chatzi isarin first. So therefore, the kivan damar mincha. Therefore, so he said, mincha. Right away, he's chayiv nisarin. Then he says, chatzi yisarin. Ki amar chatzi yisarin, v'loy klub kamar. That taka doesn't mean anything at all. And then, ki hadar amar yisarin, when he mentions the second yisarin, maisi yisarin achvina. But I guess if he says yisarin, that's good enough. Yisarin is good enough. Chatzi Yisarin isn't good enough, but a Yisarin is good enough. Now, it's only when the explanation of the mincha doesn't match, that's when you say the mincha will be chayv you anyway. But if you say harei Allah Yisarin Silas, that's mamish what a mincha is. That's what it must be. Okay, Zok to Gemara. Okay, so now that we hashada sinalach, and now that we're in this place where the case is where you said harei mincha chatzi Yisarin. Yochi, we have a big problem, because it says Rab Shimon Poiter Shaloi his nadev keder chamis nadvin. Right? Shimon holds you're potter in this case because you didn't express it properly. Am I? I don't understand. What is the problem? What is the problem? Zokt Rashi Ihachi Rab Shimon Poiter to keep in the Tovas Lashon Rishon ve'iu Amar Mincha, and he said Mincha harayis nadev keder chamis nadvin. Once we say that the word mincha itself is mentioned first, and that means a proper mincha, So how could Reb Shimon say, no matter what he added later, how could Reb Shimon say that he wasn't misnadav kederech misnadvin? We're going with the shita of Beishamai that your tafis lashon rishon, and therefore, why would Reb Shimon argue? Zok to Gemara, Amar Rav Reb Shimon b'shitas Rabbi Yosy Amra. He's not going with Beishamai. He's going according to the shita of Rabbi Yosy. Damar af b'gmar dvorav adam matfis. Reb Shimon says you look at the whole thing of what he said, and therefore, even though he said mincha at the beginning, but if he said mincha chatzi yisaron, you look at everything together, and that's not the normal way to be noidiv a mincha, and therefore it has no validity at all. Let's see Rashi. Af b'gmar dvorav adam nitfas. The lo yazlin basar lashon rishon l'chudei, v'lo basar achron l'chudei. You look at the blend, you look at the whole statement that he said, and you figure out what he meant. Mincha, chatzi, isarin, v'isarin. What did he mean? Pirushe kabafarish. He's explaining himself. Mincha shel chatzi, isarin, v'isarin. I'm giving a mincha, the half of isarin and an isarin. Now that's not a normal way to be noidiv a mincha. That is not a standard way to be noidiv a mincha. The Bach says, let's stop here. We shouldn't continue on. And Rashi stops here. Okay, Gavaltik. Zog teile Mishnah weiter. Misnadev Oda Mincha shall shishim isarim. The maximum mincha that you could put into one keli is 60 isarim. Umevi bechli echad, and it could be brought in one keli, 60 isarim with one loig of shemen. Im Omar harei alai samachalef. What if he said, I want to be mekabel upon myself a mincha of 61 Yisraelim? Then you have to split it into two batches. Maybe shishim b'kli echad, v'echad b'kli echad. And the one over, you have to bring it as a separate mincha. Why? Why is that? Because the logic is that the yochid should not be able to bring as large of a mincha as the tzibur. So whatever we find as the largest mincha we find by a tzibur, the yachid's mincha should have to be a little bit smaller than that. Shekena tzibur maybe b'yom tov arishin shel chag shechol yosh b'Shabbos. The first day of Sukkot, if it falls out on Shabbos, the mincha is going to bring 61 esrainim. Shishim ve'echad. So since that's the largest mincha that the tzibur would bring with 61 esrainim, it's appropriate that the tzibur should bring a maximum of one less. What's the cheshbon of 61? So Rashi makes a very clear cheshbon. Zokt Rashi, very simple. There's 13 oxen that are brought on the first day of Sukkot, and there's 2 esrainim lapar, right? Shloisha esrainim lapar, shnei esrainim l'ayil. So shloisha esrainim lapar. If there's 13 paras, then there's 39 Yisraelim, right? Then there's another 14 sheep, so that's another 14 Yisraelim. Because it's Shloisha Yisraelim l'par, u'shnei Yisraelim l'ayil, v'yisarin l'keves. So 13 times 3 is 39, plus 14 for the kvasim. So 39 plus 14 is 43, it's 53, right? Then you have 2 elim. Each ayil needs 2 esrainis. So we were at 53 plus another 4 is 57. And now you have the 2 tamidim, which is 59. And now you have the 2 kivsei musaf, which each has 1 isar and a reis hamachalaf. So there's going to be salam machalaf esrainim. So it's appropriate that the yochid should bring 1 less. Amar Reb Shimon. So for Reb Shimon, what type of raya is that? These menachos are not all brought together. Every mincha is brought individually. They don't mix it all together and bring it all together. It would actually be possible if they tried to do that, because you mix in less oil per flour by the ox than you do by the keves. By the keves, it's a much more oily mixture. It's more liquidy. There's more oil per flour. So it would be possible if you mixed it together. So Amar Reb Shimon, v'aloi edul l'parim v'edul l'kvasim. Nivlolim zemzeh. So there is never by the tzibur a mincha of 61. Ella, I'm going to tell you the real reason why 60 is the maximum. Because ad shishim yechaydan livalel. He learns there's only one loig shemen, no matter how much flour you put in. You could get a mix with one loig of shemen up to 60 loigin, up to 60 yisroinim of flour. But once you have such an abundance of flour, you went over 60, you won't be able to mix it properly. Amr loy, is that so? Shishim nivlolin, the shishim vechad ein nivlolin, it's like so punklich that once you hit 61, boom, it doesn't mix anymore. Amr lam, Reb Shimon said, what do you want from me? Kol midas chachamim, kain. There's always a cutoff. For instance, Barboim saw who the toivel, Barboim saw chasakudav, and he yachal l'toil. Ben, we say that the size of a person is Arboim saw. So if it's a drop less, it won't work. It won't work. Elamai, when Chazal make a shear, there's a cutoff, and therefore the cutoff is 60. Shol she'ela l'mayla mi Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi. A shaila was asked in front of Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi, and the question was, Minayin lo'imer re'elai shishim ve'echad. Maybe shishim b'kli echad ve'echad b'kli echad. How do you know the ruling in our Mishnah? Pasuk Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi, who is Roshim Medarba b'chol makom, and the Mefarshim tell us that there was Rashi alludes to a story that was in Shabbos where these Gedolim were sitting in a cave and they were talking about the Malchus. Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi only spoke good about the Malchus. Other people spoke bad about the Malchus. So the Malchus Raimi made Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi the authority. So he was the Rosh Medaber. V'yomar, and he said, Shekein matinu tzibur maviin b'yom tov harishon shel chag liyos b'Shabbos shishim ve'echad. So therefore, daya liyachid sheyivchash b'tibur echad. Amalei Reb Shimon told him that's not a good reason, as he said in our Mishnah. V'haloi elu parim ve'elim ve'elu kfosim elu b'li lasad ava ve'elu b'li lasad raka. The mincha of the par is a much thicker mixture. There's less oil in it. Elu b'li lasad shachis ve'elu b'li lasad min abayim. They're not even done at the same time. Ve'ein nevlol mizalzah. You don't mix it together. So Amr loy or Amar loy emarata. So he told Reb Shimon, okay, you don't like my pshat, then you suggest a pshat. Amalem areyu oimer v'chol mincha belula b'shemen v'chareva kvar amar Torah have mincha sheyichoylo liv alel. Bring a mincha that could be mixed together. Amalei b'shishim nevlalin b'shishim v'echad ein nevlalin. What exactly at 61 it doesn't mix anymore? Is it so precise? Amalei, Reb Shimon said, there's always a cutoff. Kol midas chachamim kenu barbam saw hu toivel barbam saw chasakutav ein yochel litpoel kiveitza. Is metamatemus oichlin. If you have an oichel that's a shir kabeya, it's metamatemus oichlin. Kebeitza chaser shum shum. If it's missing a drop, ain't metamatemus oichlin. That's the cutoff. Shloisha a beggar that's 3 tvachim by 3 tvachim. Metame medras could become tame by somebody who steps in it, like a zov or a needle. But shloisha chaser nima. If it's missing even one thread, ain't no metame medras. Well, I can't walk on it because of one thread, but that's the cutoff. Fragt the Gemara, who cares if you can't mix the mincha if there's more than 60 yisroinim of flour? You don't need to mincha. You don't need to mix it. But nan imloy bol al kosher. Amar b'zera, true, you don't have to mix it, but you need royal lebila. Kol royal lebila and mila makeves. If it's a mixture that's mixable, you don't have to actually mix it. But but if it's a mixture that you couldn't even mix if you tried, there bila makeves boy. Amar Bibi, Amar Shimon ben Levi. Maisa bepreda achas. There was a donkey, shall base Rebbe. Now this is not directly related. Rashi says the reason why it's introduced here because we're also talking about shiurim. So there was a donkey in the house of Rebbe. Shemesa, it died. Now the question is its dam going to be metama? V'shi'aruch hachamim es dama b'revius. They were meshayir that the blood of the chamor was a revius dam, and the revius dam, when it coagulates, it becomes a kazayis, and the kazayis bosser nevelos metama. So therefore, they said it's tame because a revius dam will be metama. Maser Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna, hey Rabbi Yeshua ben Beseira, they said edus al dam levelos shehu tar. The dam of nevelos is tar. So who cares how much there is? There is no tumah in the dam of an avela. V'omer Rabbi Yeshua ben Beseira, ma'asav ayu noichrin arudiyos larayis b'histaria shel melech. The king had lions; those were his pets. So they would stab to death these wild donkeys to feed to the lions, but it made a big mess. There was blood all over the street. When the oil regal came, the streets were full of blood. Rechuv means their knee. What is it? Does it mean knee or mean ankle? Knees. They were knee deep in blood. And they came into the base of Mikdash. And no one, the Chazal didn't say, hey, you're tummy, you can't come in. But according to you, you should be tummy. Ishtik. He was quiet. He didn't answer. Amalei Reb Zreika. So Reb Zreika told him, my time Eloika Mahadir Mar. Why aren't you responding? Why aren't you responding? That maybe it is tummy. Amr Lei, he said, I can't respond. Hechi Ahadalei. How could I respond? I don't have a clear thought. I'm too stressed out because of Parnasa, and I can't possibly answer. The Omer Abchanan, it says in the pasuk regarding the klolos, "V'hoyu chayecha tuluyim lach mineged." Who is someone whose life is hanging in the balance? That's someone who doesn't have property. He doesn't have land that he can cultivate and plant and grow his own tfuah. Rather, zalakeach tfuah mishana l'shana. He has enough cash that he can buy a whole season's worth of wheat. But at the end of the day, at the end of every season, he doesn't know what he's going to be able to find for next season. So he's living under pressure. But it gets even worse. That's referring to someone who's even in worse shape. That's someone who can't even afford to buy tfuah for the season. He has to literally go hand to mouth. That's someone who can't even buy he can't even buy tfuah in the store. He has to go to the variety store because he only gets money at the last second, and he has to go buy ready-made bread. So we're talking about the levels of pressure and stress. Fahu Gavra, talking about himself, Al Palter Sabach. I'm so poor, I'm literally hand to mouth. So I don't have the clarity of mind to respond to his challenge. My Havala. Lamaisa, what's the look? Is the dam of a chamor Tomei or not? Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Marina, the Venesiava. Rabbi Yehuda was the posik of the base Hanosi, V'oiri Leikish might say. And he paskined like what he himself holds, but not necessarily do we paskin that way. And he paskins like Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai is mekel by the dam of a chamor. Titnan Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shisha Dvarim Mekulei Beis Shammai Umechumre Beis Hillel. There are 6 things where normally we know Beis Shammai is the machmer, but there are 6 cases where Beis Shammai was mekel, and which are relevant to us is dam nevelos. Beis Shammai mitarn uBeis Hillel mitamen. So Rabbi Yehuda was paskening, no problem, because I pasken like Beis Shammai that it's Torah. But we the Maaseh don't pasken like that. We'll pasken like Beis Hillel that it's Tomei. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Av Keshetimu Beis Hillel, even though Beis Hillel said that the dam of a chamor is Tomei, the dam of nevel is Tomei, lo timu eler b'revius. Only if it was a revius dam, so that it should be like a kazayis of basar, hol v'yochal likroish v'lamud al kazayis. Okay, we'll stop here.
So it would be tummy. Why weren't they tummy?
Because Rabbi Yehuda was paskening like he held like Beis Shammai. That's what Rashi says. V'hayu lahem lebeis Rabbi Meir harois v'alpiv hayu oisen called avim v'hutzivam l'shara. He was the one who said that. Sorry? No, dam of Nevela. The dam of Nevela.